مرحبا مرحبا. بس
تحب تعمل تيست أكرم للفيديو بشكل سريع بس للصوت؟ طلعت الصورة بدون صوت.
حمزة، الصورة من غير صوت. هو يعمل تيست بس عشان البث المباشر الآن يبدأ.
كمان إذا سمحت أكرم تشوف موضوع التسجيل، لأنه ما له ظاهر عندي شعار إنه علامة التسجيل، فبس ممكن تؤكد مع حمزة هي النقطة.
ما ز... لسه ما عملش التسجيل. الصوت، الفيديو ما زال من غير صوت.
نعم بدون صوت.
مرحبا عزيزي توفيق، مرحبا.
أهلا وسهلا أكرم، فراس، دان، كلهم بصفتي واسم الجميع في الغرفة.
أهلا أستاذ توفيق، ابنك رح يحضر
أهلين أستاذ توفيق،
الاجتماع؟
أهلا.
عم أقول ابنك ظاهر بالشاشة بالورا، فبس حبيت نبهك يعني.
آه.
انتبه.
أوكي.
قولي له يدخل من الرابط اللي وصله للإيميل.
احنا افترض يبدأ ولا لسه؟ عشان الساعة 4 و3 دقائق،
آه
ولا نستنى؟
نبدأ.
ممكن يا بس نعمل تيست للترجمة. وممكن نجرب أجرب. طب ممكن هو في مشكلة في الصوت عند حمزة. أنا ممكن أجرب أشغل الفيديو من عندي، بس نشوف لو الصوت كويس عندي، بستعرض من عندي ما بيكون كويس.
ما في صوت إكرام.
ما في صوت يا أكرم.
الصوت شغال؟
لا مش شغال. أوكي، كان اشتغل وقطع ثاني.
اشتغل
هو
الصوت.
يقطع شوية. شوف في الإعدادات عندك تحت بالشيرنج إنه مستوى الصوت، جودة الصوت، حاول تخش عليهم.
الصوت ما طلع، بس أكرم أنا أقترح إنه ممكن الأستاذ حمزة يشوف موضوع الصوت، بحيث نبدأ كونه في 10 دقائق بين الصعب.
طيب احنا ممكن نبدأ على بال ما حمزة يحل المشكلة.
ده صار يعني بالضبط مع النوم. في هذه الفعالية الصغيرة التي تحمل طياتها كان يكون كثير. في البداية أحب كل النظام مع أحب كل يكون معنا. هو كان اليوم
آية
موضوع
صوتك مش واضح.
مهم جدا.
آية صوتك مش واضح
وكيف
بيقطع.
اللقاء في الجنسي الأطراف مش واضح. طب ثاني.
طيب معلش، ممكن في مشكلة في النت عند آية. ممكن أنا أبدأ. طبعا هذه الفعالية كما وصلتكم في الدعوة، هي تأتي ضمن مشروع سيف، والتي تنفذه مؤسسة رصد لحقوق الإنسان بالشراكة مع التحالف اليمني لرصد انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، وبدعم وتمويل من معهد دي تي انستيتيوت. كذا صوتي واضح؟ أتمنى بس التأكيد. أوكي. طبعا أنا أكرم الشوافي، رئيس مؤسسة رصد لحقوق الإنسان. وأحب بس كذا بشكل سريع أعرفكم على منظمة رصد لحقوق الإنسان. هي منظمة حقوقية غير حكومية، تأسست كمبادرة شبابية في العام 2016 نتيجة للازدياد الممنهج في انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في اليمن، بهدف المساهمة في حفظ حقوق الضحايا، وللمساهمة في تعزيز المحاسبة وتحقيق العدالة والسلام في اليمن. طبعا واجهت المؤسسة تحديات كثيرة في الحصول على ترخيص عمل، ولكن استطعنا الحصول على الترخيص عمل من وزارة الشؤون الاجتماعية والعمل بعد تحديات عديدة في عام 2020 في شهر يناير. تعمل رصد لحقوق الإنسان بشكل رئيسي على توثيق انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، على توثيق انتهاكات حقوق الإنسان في اليمن. وكذلك وفق منهجية عمل طورت بما يلائم طبيعة النزاع غير الدولي في اليمن، والمعايير والإعلانات والعهود والمواثيق العالمية لحقوق الإنسان. كما نعمل في رصد أيضا على حشد التأييد والجهود للحد من هذه الانتهاكات وفضح مرتكبي الانتهاكات تمهيدا لمحاسبتهم. ونركز بشكل أساسي على توعية المجتمع المدني والضحايا بشكل خاص بحقوقهم وآليات حمايتها بما يكفل تعزيز أوضاع حقوق الإنسان في اليمن. تدعم رصد جهود المناصرة بشكل كبير ضمن تحالفات واسعة من المنظمات المحلية والدولية من خلال أنشطة الدعوة المستمرة واللقاءات مع صناع القرار السياسيين والدوليين كمان من منظمات مجتمع مدني وهيئات أممية. وتعمل بشكل أيضا رئيسي مع المدافعين على حقوق الإنسان على المستوى المحلي والدولي للدفع باتجاه تعزيز العدالة في اليمن كأساس لتحقيق السلام المستدام. اعتمدت عدد من الهيئات الدولية في تقاريرها والإحصائيات الصادرة عنها بيانات مؤسسة رصد لحقوق الإنسان كأحد أبرز المصادر المحلية الموجودة في اليمن. ونتعاون بشكل وثيق مع فريق الخبراء التابع لمجلس الأمن المعني باليمن. وكان لنا تعاون أيضا بارز في مع فريق الخبراء البارزين التابع لمجلس حقوق الإنسان، والذي بكل أسف تم إيقاف عمله منذ عامين. وحاليا نعمل أيضا بشكل وثيق مع عدد من المنظمات الدولية كهيومن رايتس ووتش والعفو الدولية وعدد من المنظمات المعنية في اليمن. من خلال مشروع سيف نعمل في رصد لحقوق الإنسان مع شركائنا كأحد مشاريع المؤسسة على تعزيز الوعي وضمان حقوق الأطفال خلال النزاع في اليمن من خلال استراتيجية تتضمن 3 أهداف: حملات التوثيق المجتمعية وتوثيق التثقيف المجتمعية وتوثيق الانتهاكات وتعزيز الحوار بين مختلف الجهات الفاعلة. سأدع هذا المحور لزميلي فراس سيتحدث عنه بشكل أوسع. يأتي تركيزنا اليوم وتقريرنا اليوم هو امتداد للتقرير السابق الذي أصدره شركائنا في التحالف اليمني لرصد حقوق الإنسان أطفال اليمن انتهاكات المستمرة، والذي ركز على الانتهاكات ال6 الجسيمة. ولكن نحن اليوم نركز بشكل أساسي على الانتهاك العنف الجنسي الذي يتعرض له الأطفال في اليمن. هذه الجريمة التي لطالما كان مسكوت عنها بتواطؤ كبير من جميع أطراف النزاع في اليمن. بدأنا العمل عليها منذ العام 2018 في محافظة تعز، وكان حينها عملنا مع منظمة العفو الدولية على إصدار تقرير، وأيضا قمنا بتوثيق ما يقارب 30 حالة. بكل أسف عجزنا أن نؤثر على السلطات لتقوم بدور فاعل في محاسبة مرتكبي هذه الانتهاكات. تسبب لنا الموضوع بكثير من التحديات وكثير من العقبات. تم على إثره إغلاق مقر مؤسستنا في تعز، وتعرض فريقنا لكثير من التهديدات والاعتداءات المستمرة. طبعا أنا التقرير الذي سيتم عرضه اليوم هي حصيلة عمل عام كامل سيتحدث عن التقرير، والذي اخترنا أن يكون الاسم له أخاف من الفضيحة، وحيث أنه استنبطنا هذا الاسم أو هذا العنوان من إفادة أحد الضحايا، وهو يعبر عن عنوان بالغ عن تكثيف الوصم الذي يشعر به الضحايا ويمنعهم من الإبلاغ. فمبدئيا أنا سأترك المجال لزميلي فراس للتحدث أكثر عن مشروع سيف، وإلى أن نصلح الخلل الفني في الفيلم ونعمل على استعراض الفيلم الوثائقي الذي قمنا بإنتاجه، ومن ثم ننتقل لبقية المحاور وفقا للأجندة المقدمة لكم.
إلي الآن أكرم هيك. أكرم أكرم عم تسمعني؟
صوتك ضعيف يا فراس، ممكن ترفع الصوت شوية؟
صوتي الآن واضح؟ ممكن أبدأ؟
أوكي.
أبدأ الآن؟
أوكي تمام.
تمام، شكرا أكرم. Hello everyone. Thanks so much Akram for this introduction. My name is Firas Hamdouni. I'm a senior program manager at DT Institute. Quickly, DT Institute is an international development organization committed to doing development differently. Thank you to our partner Rust Organization or Watch for Human Rights for organizing this webinar. And a warm welcome also to our donor representatives from DRL for their support to the human rights efforts in Yemen. A warm welcome also to our partners, panelists, and guests. Let me quickly tell you about our project SAFE without repetition to what was mentioned by Akram. So simply, SAFE stands for Supporting Awareness, Facilitating Enforcement of Children's Rights in the Yemeni Conflict. It's all about protecting Yemeni children from grave violations happening during the unfortunate conflict in Yemen. SAFE program seeks to consolidate efforts to protect Yemeni children from grave human rights violations by creating and maintaining pressure to keep the rights of Yemeni children firmly on the agenda and promoting concrete actions and recommendations to end impunity. We are working with our two partners, Russell's Coalition or YCMHRV and Watch for Human Rights to achieve the goal or the outcome from SAFE program. So we have conducted community and victim-oriented civic education campaigns to empower safe reporting of grave human rights violations against children. We have also worked on documenting and investigating the reported violations against children to shape dialogue on justice and accountability. We have also considered conducting a dialogue among Yemeni justice stakeholders on protecting children. I would like also to quickly introduce our coalition, which is called the Justice for Yemen-backed Coalition, which is supported and coordinated by DT Institute. This coalition consists of 10 Yemeni human rights organizations committed to advancing and promoting and protecting human rights in Yemen. The coalition efforts have had significant impact, amplifying the voices of victims, marginalized communities, and advocating for accountability during the ongoing conflict in Yemen. Under this coalition, as I mentioned, we have 10 partners, 2 partners from SAFE. They are under this coalition, again, YCMHRV and Watch for Human Rights. Under SAFE program, also, we have contributed to the formulation and dissemination of joint recommendations for the Universal Periodic Review. This collaborative initiative amplified the voices of victims and survivors. Also, we took that as an opportunity to underscore the urgency of addressing grave violations and holding perpetrators accountable. Under SAFE program, our 2 partners have documented 309 grave human rights violations against children, emphasizing the ongoing impact of the conflict on the Yemeni children, even after the truce that was signed in April 2022. Right now, as we all know, Yemen is at a turning point. There is a hope for permanent ceasefire, but there are still challenges. Especially with the Houthis' escalation in the Red Sea, which really affect the situation of the human rights in Yemen, particularly regarding the reported increase in child recruitment cases in Houthis' controlled areas. And why I'm mentioning child recruitment? Because from this project and from our work on other projects, we see there is like an important aspect that really deserves deeper analysis and attention, which is related to the link between sexual violence and exploitation from one side and child recruitment from another side. As armed groups capitalize on the vulnerabilities arising from sexual violence and exploitation to unfortunately recruit children. For example, children who have suffered sexual abuse or exploitations may become more vulnerable to recruitment due to feeling of isolation, trauma, or lack of support. And we have seen also in Yemen how perpetrators of sexual violence may exploit their actions by offering promises of protection or support. Among the recommendations that we have shared, including urging the Yemeni government to adopt and enforce laws safeguarding children from domestic, sexual, and gender-based violence, ensuring full access to justice for victims, and ending impunity for perpetrators, most importantly here, including military and police officers. Thank you for your time joining this webinar and looking forward to hearing insights from other colleagues and panelists. Over to you, Akram.
أشكر عزيزي فراس لهذا التقديم. سوف نتوقف حاليا مع فيلم وثائقي تم إنتاجه من قبل رصد لحقوق الإنسان في إطار مشروع سيف. حقيقة هذا الفيلم الذي عانينا كثيرا حتى إنتاجه، وهو يمثل نماذج لقصص واقعية تم رصدها وتوثيقها من قبل رصد حقوق الإنسان. نحيي الضحايا الذين تحلوا بالشجاعة الكافية ليكونوا ضمن هذا الفيديو، أن تعرض قضاياهم كنماذج لنعبر عن هذه المأساة وهذه الجريمة التي تتفاقم بشكل كبير في ظل صمت مخزي وتواطؤ كبير من السلطات والنافذين أيضا في عديد من المحافظات في التستر على الجناة وعدم السماح بإنفاذ القانون والمحاسبة بحق هؤلاء وما ارتكبوه من جرم. وأيضا نسعى من خلال هذا الفيلم أن يكون بادرة تحفز الضحايا على الحديث وتكسر حاجز الصمت الذي خلفته هذه الجريمة في المجتمع بحجة العيب وبمزعم العيب، وجعلتها تتفاقم وجعلت الجناة أيضا يتبجحون أكثر في ارتكابهم وتكرار هذه الجريمة مع ضحايا آخرين. حقيقة هذا الفيلم واجه العديد من التحديات ابتداء من إنتاجه والتهديدات التي تعرضت لشركات الإنتاج أيضا بشأن إنتاج هذا الفيديو من قبل السلطات في صنعاء وأيضا في عدن، والتهديدات التي تلقوها مما اضطرنا لتصويره في بعض المشاهد في اليمن والإنتاج خارج اليمن. سنعرض الفيلم معكم وإن شاء الله ينال استحسانكم. والفيلم هو متوفر باللغتين العربية والإنجليزية. سنضع روابط النسختين أيضا في صندوق الرسائل للاطلاع عليه، وسنقوم بعرض النسخة العربية وهي مترجمة أيضا للنسخة الإنجليزية، وبإمكانكم أيضا مشاهدة النسخة الأخرى عبر الرابط الذي سيتم إرساله. حمزة، ممكن نبدأ؟
تتوسع مأساة العنف الجنسي ضد أطفال اليمن، ويدمر الاغتصاب مستقبل الضحايا، فيما يستغل الفاعلون مناصبهم في الدولة وخوف الضحايا وصمتهم ليستمروا في أفعالهم المشينة وينجوا من أي عقوبة. ذكرت دراسة صادرة عن منظمة حماية الأطفال في العام 2021 أن عدد الأطفال المعرضين لخطر العنف الجنسي الذي ترتكبه الجهات الفاعلة في النزاع أعلى اليوم ب10 مرات مما كان عليه في عام 1990، وأن اليمن من ضمن أبرز البلدان التي لديها أعلى نسبة أطفال يعيشون في مناطق النزاع، وأنما نسبته 83% منهم يواجهون خطر العنف الجنسي. مؤسسة رصد لحقوق الإنسان وثقت العديد من القصص المسكوت عنها خلال سنوات النزاع في اليمن، وهي بكل الأحوال قصص قليلة جدا بين سيل عارم من الانتهاكات التي تحدث. إنها مدينة إب، حيث تبدو الحياة وديعة وهادئة ومثلها يعيش الناس، لكن الحقيقة أنها ليست كذلك. هنا مثلا اغتصب أحد المشرفين طفلا لم يتجاوز 10 من عمره، ثم خنقه وأجبر 3 أطفال آخرين تحت تهديد السلاح على تهشيم وجهه بالحجارة. ليفارق الحياة، وبعدها رمى بجثته في مجرى السيل المجاور للقرية. يقول والد الطفل:
ابني الآن عادوا بتلاشى الموتى، شخصيات كبيرة في البحث الجنائي يستروا على القضية، والنيابة لبست القضية لمجموعة أطفال سبت توقع أحداث. ما عندي سند ولا ظهر في السلطة، واطلب العون القانوني لإنصافنا.
وبعيدا قليلا عن جغرافيا مدينة إب، قريبا من وجع اليمنيين الواحد، في عدن. قائد عسكري رفقة أحد أفراده اغتصب عدة مرات طفلة مع شقيقها. بعد أن نزحت أسرتهما إلى عدن بحثا عن عيش وأمن وكرامة. ثم أجبر المغتصبان والد الضحيتين على التقاط صور معهم بوضعية مخلة لتغيير مسار القضية. الأسرة الضحية من الشمال دون ظهر أو حام هنا في مدينة عدن. استغل المجرمان ذلك ليهددا الأسرة بالقتل أو الترحيل لمواجهة الموت في مدينة نزحوا منها هربا من الموت أصلا.
كل اللي حصل لنا ما يصدق، ضربونا وشتمونا واهتدونا، كل مرة كنت أحاول أقاوم. الذي حصل لنا بشع جدا، دمروا حياتي كلها، هددونا بالقتل لو تحاكينا.
وبين إب وعدن، وتحديدا في تعز، طفل في 13 من عمره عاد باكيا إلى منزله بعد اغتصابه وتصويره في إحدى البيوت المهجورة من شاب يعمل والده في السلك العسكري. وبعد الانتهاء من جريمته نشر المقطع بين أصدقائه ليستغل اثنان الفيديو المصور ويجبران الطفل على الممارسة.
وكلمت أمي باللي حصل لي عشان كنت خايف منها من الفضيحة.
زاد استغلال الجناة وابتزازهم، فترك الطفل منزله ومدينته ومستقبله وانتقل للعيش مع والده في مدينة أخرى قبل أن يقع مجددا في الابتزاز ويرضخ.
اشتكينا الفاعل للبحث الجنائي، حبسوه شهر وخرجوه عشان عنده وساطة نسحب النفوذ. حرموني ابني لأني رفضت أتنازل زي ما فعل أبوه وأخذ فلوس.
في مارب، عاد طفل في 12 من عمره منهكا مفزوعا إلى المنزل. رفض الإفصاح عما حدث له وكتم كل شيء حتى ساءت حالته، فاضطرت والدته إلى إسعافه. أجري له الفحص اللازم فاتضح تعرضه للاغتصاب. استغل الفاعل الطفل في جلب الأغراض إلى منزله ثم اغتصبه. عجزت الأم عن الشكوى بسبب تهديدها بالقتل. تكرر لطفلها السيناريو بعد أشهر وتعرض للاغتصاب مرة أخرى من مجند وآخر مدني. تقدمت والدته بشكوى إلى البحث الجنائي. وبدلا من ملاحقة الجناه تعرض طفلها للاحتجاز وما يزال محتجزا حتى هذه اللحظة.
تعرف ابني ليش محبوس لنا؟ لأنه ضحية.
لأنه ضحية. هذه بكل أسف قصص تعكس وضعا بالغ السوء وصل إليه الناس ممن يفترض بهم حماية الساكنين في الأصل. استغل النافذون خوف الناس وصمتهم ومضوا في طريقهم لتدمير المجتمع وإشباع نزواتهم الكثيرة. ضمنوا الإفلات من العقوبة فلم تردعهم أوجاع الضحايا ودموعهم وانكساراتهم بين الناس. العدالة لأطفال اليمن.
تمام أستاذ أكرم تفضل.
أنا رجعت آية، بس كان في عندي إشكالية في النت. الصوت واضح؟ ألو ألو.
تمام آية، بس لو سمحتي ترفعي صوتك شوي لحتى نسمعك أوضح.
طبعا كلنا شفنا الفيلم. أنا كنت جزء من هذا الحدث، من هذا الفيلم الذي أعد، بحكم أني كنت شغالة على رصد بودكاست، وهي سلسلة حلقات إذاعية كانت تعرض على موقع مؤسسة رصد. طبعا التقرير الموجود واللي ممكن أكرم لو يتكرم يحط رابطه على الشات، من العام 2022 إلى 23 رصدت مؤسسة رصد أكثر من 13 حادثة عنف جنسي، منها 18 ضحية بينهم 13 فتيات. طبعا هذه الأعداد قليلة جدا مقارنة بما لم يتم الوصول إليها من وسائل الإعلام أو حتى المؤسسات العاملة على حقوق الإنسان. عندنا 16 حادثة اغتصاب وحادثتين لمحاولة اغتصاب. الحديث حول الموضوع في الحقيقة يطول كثير،
يا
وإنه في
آية،
كثير
آية
من الضحايا
معلش،
أهاليهم
آية
رافضين.
معلش، المترجمة تكلمك شوية هدي الصوت عشان تلحق تترجم، يعني أنت تتكلمي بشكل سريع.
قلت بأنه كثير من الضحايا غير مغيبين تماما عن وسائل الإعلام. كثير ضحايا آخرين أهاليهم يرفضوا التحدث أو صعوبة الوصول إليهم، خاصة اللي موجودين في الأرياف واللي يتلقوا تهديد مباشر سواء من الجهات الحكومية أو من الفاعلين للحادثة بشكل خاص. الآن إحنا بننتقل لمحور آخر، بيكون معنا أحد المتحدثين وهو صحفي سيد دان. هو صحفي وباحث دولي ومستشار في مجال حقوق الإنسان. سيعمل على استعراض التقرير الاستقصائي الخاص بالتقرير الذي سيعرض اليوم، هو أخاف من الفضيحة. السيد دان هو صحفي وباحث مع منظمة التي، وأيضا يركز على في أعماله على مجال توثيق الانتهاكات ضد حقوق الإنسان. تفضل.
شكرا أستاذة آية. أنا صوتي واضح؟
اوكي دان، صوتك واضح كويس.
Okay, great. Let me go ahead and share my screen quickly. I'm going to do this one in English. Is everyone can people see my screen? بينت من عندكم الشاشة?
Yes, yes.
Okay, great.
اوكي تمام دان.
All right. Thanks a lot, everyone. I will be presenting today the results of Watch for Human Rights' report that Miss Aya was just talking about. I'll try to keep my cadence relatively slow so that the translator can keep up. And let's jump right in. So as Ms. Aya just mentioned, the report that Watch for Human Rights worked on covers incidents from April 2022. So that was the beginning of the humanitarian truce in Yemen to the end of last year. And the report documented 13 incidents of sexual violence against children, including 18 victims total. So 3 girls and 15 boys. And Watch for Human Rights emphasized in the report that the discrepancy in these numbers between girls and boys were due to the difficulty in reaching girl victims primarily. Obviously, social stigma makes it difficult to reach victims of all types, children who are victims of sexual assault, but in particular, the organization faced challenges in reaching girls. And Watch for Human Rights also documented, in addition to the initial assaults, 16 cases of rape and 2 of attempted rape. Many of the victims were subject to follow-on or concomitant violations as well. For example, filming the assault, blackmail, exploitation, etc. So just to briefly go into the methodology of the report, it was a team of 12 researchers, men and women, who conducted the data gathering from April to December of last year. There were 9 governorates that were included in the research. They're listed on the screen, but the important point is that these governorates include areas under control of all the different conflict parties in Yemen, including Ansar Allah or the Houthis, including the internationally recognized government and the Southern Transitional Council. The main data sources for this report were 36 interviews with the victims and their immediate family members and witnesses, as well as a review of investigation documents like court and police records and medical records and photos. And in addition, Watch for Human Rights met with a number of governmental and non-governmental organizations that work on child protection in Yemen. So I'm not going to give a comprehensive list, but just to give the audience an idea, on the governmental side, Watch for Human Rights met with sources in the Criminal Pursuit Division and with juvenile courts, the Office of Social Affairs and Labor, etc. And on the non-governmental side, Watch for Human Rights collaborated with other NGOs who work on this issue, both Yemeni non-governmental organizations and international organizations like Ipsos and Save the Children, etc. So one of the main findings of this report was that there is severely limited reporting on the issue of sex crimes against children in Yemen. Watch for Human Rights pointed to, in the first place, social stigma as one of the main factors that prevent children from talking about sexual violations they've been subjected to, or coming forward with violations to authorities. And in many cases, and I'll talk about this later, in many of the documented cases, authorities, when children do report, authorities treat children victims as deviants or as criminals, rather than as victims of a grave violation. And this particular finding has been echoed as well by other bodies, that other monitoring mechanisms in Yemen. The UN panel of experts wrote in a report in 2023 that, quote, cases of conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence perpetrated by parties to the conflict remain severely underreported, owing mainly to the stigma associated with these violations. And anecdotally, a specialist in the Office of Social Affairs and Labor in TEZ told Watch for Human Rights that in some cases, when child victims come forward, they are mistreated not only by authorities, but by their own families. And obviously, this is not universal. Many families defend and champion their children and try to get them justice when they're victims of sexual assault. But in some cases, families will treat their kids relatively harshly, and in some cases even kick them out of the house, and children victims will end up on the street or in official institutions like orphanages. So in addition to social stigma, there's also a general Watch for Human Rights wrote in the report that a lack of trust in law enforcement mechanisms and the fact that victims and families are subject to threats and harassment, all of these contribute to a severe lack of reporting on this issue in Yemen. And Watch for Human Rights conducted a literature review of governmental studies that deal with sexual assault and found that they basically don't exist. The organization only found one governmental body in Yemen that actually refers to this issue in a somewhat oblique manner, and we'll get to that later. But in general, the lack of the lack of reporting on this issue is reflected in the lack of government studies on the topic or information in general. So one of the other main findings of this report is that, in general, the environment of conflict in Yemen has led to an environment that is conducive to sexual violence, including against children. And there are many factors that contribute to this. In general, in Yemen, there has been, after over 9 years of war, a pervasive climate of impunity in general. This applies to all types of criminal acts, not just sexual violence, but all sorts of crimes and violations of Yemeni national law. It also applies to violations of international law. Obviously, all parties in Yemen, without exception, all the conflict parties have been documented committing repeated and grave violations of international and humanitarian law over the course of the war, and there hasn't been any accountability forthcoming for that. And Watch for Human Rights pointed out that, in fact, and as Mr. Akram mentioned at the beginning of his presentation, several years ago, the group of eminent experts on Yemen, which was an international body documenting apparent breaches of international law, was disbanded, or its mandate was not renewed following a lobbying campaign from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So there's a pervasive climate of impunity in general with regards to criminal activity and violations of national and international law. There's also a weakness of accountability mechanisms within Yemen that contributes to a spread of sex crimes against children. And in particular, the justice system in Yemen, in areas of all the various parties' control, has been weakened and politicized after 9 years of conflict. Watch for Human Rights also wrote in their report that organizations that should be responsible for child protection are often ineffective. For example, the Higher Council for Motherhood and Childhood, like many national institutions in Yemen, has been split between Ansarullah Houthi areas and the internationally recognized government areas. This council is supposed to serve as the highest national body responsible for child protection and coordinating governmental and non-governmental action in that regard. And in government areas, in internationally recognized government areas, it does not, as of the time of the report's writing, have a dedicated leadership body. So, the institutions that should be prosecuting cases of sexual assault and looking out for the welfare of children have been weakened by conflict as well. Another example is the court focused on human rights that the government of Yemen announced it was intending to create, and that court has not appeared. It has not actually been created. And finally, another conflict-related factor that has contributed to a spread of sexual violence against children is the general security deterioration after 9 years of war. And that one is pretty self-explanatory. The graphic you all see at the bottom of the slide reflects the 18 victims who were documented in this report. Out of the 18, 12 did not receive any sort of justice. Their perpetrators were not held to account. And for 3 of the victims, their perpetrators were on trial as of the time of the report's writing. One of the victims was actually she herself convicted by a court for crimes related to her assault, and we'll get to that later. In 2 cases, the status of the perpetrators of these assaults was unclear as of the time of writing. So another one of the report's main findings was that the conflict parties have played a very active role in the spread of sex crimes against children during the war. And this takes many forms. Obviously, it's been well documented at this point, particularly by UN mechanisms, that various conflict parties have themselves committed sexual violence against particularly detainees in detention sites in Yemen. But even when the perpetrators are individuals or acting, let's say, in an individual capacity, often the perpetrators are directly affiliated with one of the conflict parties. Or even if they're not, for example, as a soldier or a commander or a supervisor in Houthi areas, or even when they're not directly affiliated with a party to the conflict, they can bring their influence to bear on one of the conflict parties in order to evade accountability for crimes. So you'll see that out of the victims who were documented in this report, in the table below, Watch for Human Rights listed out the different conflict parties that they deemed responsible, if not for perpetrating the crime, then for covering it up. So you can see from the table, the Southern Transitional Council was implicated in six of the victims who were subject to sexual assault, the Ansarullah or Houthi movement to 5, the government of Yemen 4, and the Joint Resistance Forces for 1. And again, the role of the conflict parties in perpetuating these crimes is multifaceted. There are many ways in which they do it, but the point is all of them are involved, if not directly, then indirectly through covering up and enabling perpetrators to escape accountability. So one of the more alarming findings from the report was that oftentimes victims, when they do come forward, them and their families, they are treated by authorities as being deviants or criminals. And of the 18 victims who were documented in this report, 3 were detained on criminal charges and then subsequently released, and an additional 5 were detained and remain in detention as of the report's writing. So I would just like to bring up a quick example that was documented in the report that I think drives home the point. And obviously, the details of the case have been anonymized, and this is not the victim's real name, as with all of the cases documented in the report. But this case involves a 12-year-old girl named Sausan who was abducted by forces affiliated with the joint by soldiers affiliated with the joint forces on Yemen's west coast. and she was held for a period of 12 days, approximately 12 days, and subject to sexual assault. And when her father finally found her and tried to take the case to the authorities and get justice for her, she was charged alongside one of the perpetrators for zina, or extramarital sex. And according to the documents that were reviewed by Watch for Human Rights, the authorities never looked into the kidnapping, the enforced disappearance, the rape. They only looked into the, this idea that this 12-year-old girl had been involved in some immoral sex acts. And so she received a suspended sentence. The perpetrator of the rape received, I think, a year in jail, if I'm remembering correctly. But the point is, her case painfully illustrates that often when victims do come forward, they are treated again by authorities as themselves responsible in some way for their ordeal. Another one of the report's important findings was that victims are frequently subject to threats and harassment, both victims and their families. So out of the 18 victims that were documented in this report, 4 of them withdrew their complaints after reporting because they received threats or harassment. An additional 6 faced pressure to withdraw in the form of threats and harassment. And oftentimes, or not, I shouldn't say often, sometimes the threats and harassment are paired with financial offers as well, as additional pressure to get victims to drop cases or their families to drop cases. So out of the 4 victims who withdrew their complaints after reporting, Watch for Human Rights documented that 2 of them received financial compensation. Their families did. And in one case, this was equivalent to $2,000 or 3 million Yemeni rial. In another case, it was equivalent to 50,000 Yemeni rial, which is about $40. So the sums can vary widely. But often the threats and harassment that victims are subject to are paired with financial offers. And in general, this is sort of a related point, as a result of all the dynamics that we've talked about so far, the social stigma, a lack of trust in law enforcement, the fact that victims and their families are threatened and harassed, the fact that victims are treated as criminals themselves, all of these factors have contributed to a situation in which some families opt for informal, traditional justice mechanisms rather than going through the legal system. So this is anecdotal, but Watch for Human Rights documented, or they heard from a source in the executive unit for IDP camp management in Tez, as well as a source in the criminal pursuit division in Aden, who both said that in some cases, victims' families will opt for traditional justice, which usually involves reconciliation and a payout, as opposed to going through the justice system. So I'm nearing the end of the presentation. One additional point that's related, that's important to reference, that Watch for Human Rights emphasized in the report, is the vulnerability of displaced children. So 4 out of 18 victims in the report were displaced. This, in general, displaced children who can be unaccompanied. Sometimes children who are displaced are the heads of their household, despite being minors. These sorts of dynamics make them extra vulnerable. They're in areas where they don't have support or family. The Interagency Humanitarian Evaluation wrote in 2022 that displaced children, particularly in IDP sites, face grave risks, including exploitation and abuse. And Watch for Human Rights, I mentioned earlier in the report that, or earlier in this presentation, that there is a noted lack of government information on sexual assault, particularly as it relates to children. The one governmental organization that Watch for Human Rights found had reported on sex crimes in general in some form or another was the Executive Unit for IDP Camp Management. And the Executive Unit wrote in 2023 that in 2 2% of government-controlled camps, and these were, I think, 640 camps they were surveyed, displaced people were subject to the threat of sexual harassment. And Watch for Human Rights noted in their report that that they think that because of social custom, that this number is a severe undercount, and that also the incidents that the executive unit are referring to as harassment are actually more likely classified as sexual assault. But that, again, social considerations prevent the executive unit from reporting openly about the scope, the extent of the problem. And some other statistics that were included in the executive unit for IDP camp management's report that indicate the vulnerability of displaced children are that 95% of camps lack a social worker and 88% of camps lack a child-friendly space. So these statistics give a sense of the extent of the vulnerability of children, displaced children in particular, in displacement sites. Just to end, Watch for Human Rights wrote more than a dozen recommendations in their report. I put the ones here that are probably most relevant to this audience. Considering law enforcement's in general, law enforcement's inappropriate and lax response to sex crimes, Watch for Human Rights recommended that conflict parties and international donors build local law enforcement capacity to properly deal with these crimes in a way that matches the gravity of the situation, to establish programs in schools and media to combat stigma, as we've seen stigma as one of the main issues that both contributes to a lack of reporting and follow through by the authorities when it comes to sex crimes against children. Also, Watch for Human Rights recommended that conflict parties and organizations working in child protection in Yemen provide liaison points in rural areas in particular to facilitate reporting. And finally, the organization pointed to, in the future, for future documentation and research efforts, the need to pair documentation with support and protection programming. Watch for Human Rights found, as they were researching this project, that many families were hesitant to talk with them because the documentation efforts were not accompanied by support and protection programming. So those were four of the recommendations that were most pertinent to this audience. And that's about the end of my presentation. Thanks a lot, everyone, for your attention. أستاذ أكرم، اتفضل.
Thank you so much, Dan. أكرم أو آية، ممكن لو سمحتوا تتفضلوا.
شكرا للعزيز دان. كان استعراض التقرير جيد جدا، وأعتقد أنه أورد أبرز ما جاء في التقرير، وستجدون في صندوق الرسائل الرابط المباشر للحصول على التقرير بنسختيه العربية والإنجليزية. بإمكانكم الاطلاع عليه وموافاتنا في حال لديكم أي تفاصيل. أكرر على نقطة أنه لجميع الحاضرين من يريدون تقديم أي أسئلة للأخوة المتحدثين أو أي تعليقات، هنالك صندوق question and answer، بإمكانكم وضع السؤال الخاص بكم، وبعد انتهاء المتحدثين سيتم الرد على أسئلتكم. الاستعراض الآخر طبعا معنا الأستاذ القدير والزميل العزيز توفيق الحميدي، وهو محامي وناشط حقوقي بارز، رئيس منظمة سامي الحقوق والحريات. العزيز توفيق شغل العديد من المناصب القانونية والحكومية، وعضو نشط في العديد من المنظمات الحقوقية اليمنية المتخصصة بالمرأة والطفولة، وهو خبير في الشأن اليمني الحقوقي. شارك في العديد من دورات مجلس حقوق الإنسان في جنيف، إضافة إلى مشاركته النشطة في العديد من البرامج والمؤتمرات الحقوقية بالشأن اليمني. العزيز توفيق سيقدم لنا استعراض حول فرص وآليات المساءلة المساءلة الدولية لضحايا العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاع. فكل التحية لك عزيزي توفيق، والمايك لك.
شكرا جزيلا الأخ العزيز أكرم. الأخ فراس، دان، الجميع كلهم بصفته واسمه.
توفيق ما في الصوت.
صوت. والآن ألو.
واضح الصوت.
عزيزي توفيق الصوت.
موجود.
أكرم، أنا أعتقد الصوت واضح
عزيزي
لي.
توفيق ما في الصوت عندك.
ممكن تتحقق من عندك، بس أنا أسمع توفيق بشكل جيد.
وانا كمان نفس الشيء واضح من عندي.
الآن ركبت السماعة، واضح الصوت. دان فراس صح؟
واضح، نعم، تفضل.
أوكي. الشكر جزيل لمؤسسات أو منظمات رصد لحقوق الإنسان. في الحقيقة ونحن نتحدث عن موضوع الانتهاكات الجنسية التي يتعرض لها الأطفال أثناء النزاع. أنا باعتقادي نتحدث عن أهم المواضيع الشائكة والتي خلفتها الحرب اليمنية. ومن المهم جدا أيضا أننا يعني أو إذا جاز التعبير سأكون مضطرا للتعريج ولو بعجالة بسيطة قبل أن ألج لآليات المساءلة لمنتهكي جرائم مثل هذه الانتهاكات، لمناقشة بعض التحديات ربما التي تشكل وعائق مهم أمام نشطاء حقوق الإنسان وأمام رصد مثل هذه الانتهاكات الخطيرة والمؤثرة على مستقبل الأطفال الذين يقعون ضحايا مثل هذه الانتهاكات. أنا باعتقادي هنالك تحديات جمة، أولها اليوم تحدي انعدام الأمن الذي خلفته الحرب اليمنية، وخلقت معه بيئة مضطربة وخطرة. خلقت فوضى على نطاق واسع في الكثير من المحافظات، في الكثير من القرى. هذه صعبت بصورة ما وصول نشطاء حقوق الإنسان أو المنظمات المهتمة برصد مثل هذه الانتهاكات لرصد مثل هذه الانتهاكات. وبالتالي نرى حتى التقارير التي تصدر والتغطيات الإعلامية ربما قد تكون قليلة نوعا ما. الناحية الثانية من التحديات تفشي وانتشار ثقافة الصمت والوضع الاقتصادي في المجتمع اليمني. في مثل هذه الجرائم غالبا تسود ثقافة الصمت التقليدية، في مقابل التي أفرزتها بصورة كبيرة مفاهيم الشرف والعار، وحولت الضحية الأطفال كانوا ذكورا أو نساء إلى ضحايا، بل ربما قد يكونوا منبوذين ويصابون بتعقيدات نفسية أو اجتماعية أكبر في مثل هذه الظروف. الأسرة تفضل بصورة كبيرة أنها تصمت دون أن تظهر هذه القضايا إلى المؤسسات القضائية أو الحقوقية أو حتى إلى المؤسسات الاجتماعية، لأنها ترى أيضا في الهمس الاجتماعي، وأنا أقصد بالهمس الحديث الجانبي الذي قد يضخم أو يحول الضحية إلى شيطان وعائلته أيضا إلى منبوذة، تساهم بصورة كبيرة للأسف الشديد في تعقيد رصد مثل هذه الانتهاكات، وتحول هذه القضايا إلى قضايا تضخمها لأنها يتم تناقلها عبر أطر غير موثوقة. إما أن يتم تضخيمها أو تجزئتها، وبالتالي لا نستطيع أن نصل إلى سردية متماسكة يمكن أن نبني عليها الكثير من النتائج القانونية. وغالبا بعضها تحتاج إلى وقت طويل، غالبا لا توجد مؤسسات حقوقية متخصصة في مثل هذه الجانب، تحتاج إلى وقت طويل لكشفها والعمل عليها. أضف إلى ذلك أن الجانب
معلش زميلي توفيق، زميلي توفيق، بس ممكن شوية شوية عشان الترجمة بس.
أوكي تمام. أضف إلى أن الوضع الاقتصادي ربما والمعيشي يلعب دور. كثير من الأسر لا تريد أن تواجه المجتمع، لا تريد أن تواجه صعوبات طفلها كل يوم أمام القضاء أو أمام الجهات القضائية، أو حتى تواجه المجتمع الذي تعيش فيه. وبالتالي في بعض الأحيان تقبل مثل هذه الأسر بتعويضات خارج بين قوسين المؤسسات القضائية من أجل الصمت ودفن هذه القضية، وهم لا يدركون أنهم يدفنون القضية لكن لا يدفنون آثارها وأعراضها النفسية والفكرية لدى الطفل الصغير. لدينا إشكالية ثالثة متعلقة بضعف سيادة القانون والمؤسسات القضائية. نحن ربما من قبل الحرب نعاني في اليمن ما يمكن أن نتحدث عن الرخاوة القانونية في معالجة مثل هذه القضايا. المشرع اليمني للأسف الشديد عندما عالج قضايا الانتهاكات الجنسية للأطفال سواء ذكور أو إناث أو حتى الانتهاك التي تحدث بين الأقارب في بعض الأحيان، نظر إلى التشريع دون أن ينظر إلى الشخص نفسه، وبالتالي جاءت هذه التشريعات مهزوزة نوعا ما، منحت مساحة للإفلات منها في كثير من الأحيان، وبالتالي هذه خلقت نوع من الشك ونوع من الاهتزاز بالثقة في المؤسسات القضائية. الحرب للأسف الشديد جاءت لتضعف المؤسسات القضائية والأمنية إلى أدنى مستوياتها. الأطراف الحرب أعادت هيكلة مؤسسة القضاء ونزعت عنها صفة الحيادية بصورة كبيرة جدا، وأصبحت المؤسسات للأسف الشديد تعتبر مؤسسة لطرف من الأطراف، سواء من لحماية طرف ما أو من أجل تنفيذ عقوبة ما لطرف آخر. وهذه للأسف الشديد انعكست كما رأينا في الفيلم على الضحايا الذين وقعوا ضحايا هذه الجرائم. المؤسسات غير نافذة، أيضا المؤسسات لا تمتلك التأهيل والتقنيات الخاصة، ولا تمتلك أيضا للأسف الشديد مؤسسات تتبع القضاء مثل المؤسسات النفسية أو الاجتماعية أو الصحية التي يمكن أن يعهد إليها لهذا الطفل لإعادة ترميم نفسه، إعادة ترميمه على المستوى النفسي والاجتماعي والفكري والتعليمي. الناحية الثالثة التي واجهتنا بصورة كبيرة هو عملية ضعف الوعي، لأننا نعيش في مجتمع أبوي يحرص هذا المجتمع أن يظل شخصية الطفل رجل يرى أن في المساس به أو تعرضه لمثل هذه الانتهاك انتقاص من رجولته، أو تشكل وصمة عار لسمعته داخل المجتمع. وهذا للأسف الشديد لا يدرك أنه يأتي على حساب الطفل نفسه، يعني مستقبله القريب وعلى مستقبله البعيد. أضف إلى ذلك أنه لا يوجد عملية تنسيق بين المؤسسات التعليمية والإعلامية والثقافية والدينية في خلق فضاء توعوي بمخاطر هذه الجرائم وضرورة أن يشعر الطفل بالأمان ويشعر المجتمع أيضا بالأمان عندما يدركون أن المجتمع أصبح لحمة واحدة يعني تقف سدا منيعا في وجه هذه الجرائم. ننتقل إلى الآليات المساءلة، وأنا حاولت أختصر قدر الإمكان لأن أدرك أن الموضوع متشعب ومعقد والوقت قصير قدر الإمكان. أنا لن أذهب إلى المساءلة الوطنية إلا يعني سريعا. ربما المساءلة الوطنية تحدث عنها الفيلم بصورة أو بأخرى دان، ربما متعلقة بالقوانين الصادرة في قانون العقوبات اليمني ومتعلقة بقوانين الطفل، وهذه نعتبرها آلية وطنية وإن كانت لم ترتقي إلى المستوى الحد المطلوب. الآليات القضائية المتعلقة بمؤسسة القضاء وإيجاد بعض العقوبات الرادعة. لدينا المؤسسات المتعلقة بالطفل مثل الشؤون الاجتماعية أو المجلس الأعلى إلى غير ذلك، أو حتى الهيئة الوطنية للتحقيق في ادعاءات حقوق الإنسان. ولدينا حتى اليوم المؤسسات الحقوقية. هذه آليات وطنية. أنا بعتبر أن اليوم الآلية الوطنية الأكبر هي الرقابة الاجتماعية. عندما يتحول المجتمع إلى مراقب ويتحول المجتمع إلى مدين لمثل هذه الجرائم، أنا باعتقادي لن يتجرأ النافذون وأصحاب الأموال أو حتى المنحرفون نفسيا على ارتكاب مثل هذه الجرائم، لأنهم سيرون أو سيدركون أمامهم مجتمع متكامل يقف في وجوههم. يعني اليوم عملية تغيير التفكير الاجتماعي عملية معقدة جدا، لكن في نهاية الأمر يجب أن نحفر في هذا الجدار لنحقق نوع من التوازن. يعني أن ننتقد في مجتمع يدين الطفلة لأنها خرجت أو ذهبت في ساعة ما أو لبست زينة معينة أو ذهبت إلى فرح، ولا يدين ذلك الوحش، إنهم يقولوا أغرته أو كانت الوقت. لا، في النهاية عملية التغيير والتفكير الاجتماعي مهم أن يتم تغييرها اجتماعيا من خلال نضالات مستمرة تتولاها أنا أعتقد بالدرجة الأساسية المنظمات المجتمع المدني بصورة مستمرة لا موسمية. من القضايا أو الآليات الدولية، أنا باعتقادي أولى هذه الآليات هي القرارات الصادرة من مجلس الأمن، سواء القرار 1325 لسنة 2000 والذي يعتبر من القرارات التي ركز على المرأة في السلام والأمن وأكد على ضرورة إشراكها داخل المجتمع، وهو في نفس الوقت طالب بضرورة حماية المرأة والفتيات من العنف والعنف الجنسي في النزاعات المسلحة، ودعا إلى الحفاظ على النوع الاجتماعي في مراحل حفظ السلام وإعادة بناء السلام. هذه القرارات تعتبر من الآليات المهمة التي يمكن البناء عليها، سواء على مستوى الرصد، على مستوى التوثيق، على مستوى تقارير الظل، لأن مثل هذه القرارات تترك أثرا عميقا في زيادة الوعي بحقوق المرأة، في مكانتها، في استهجان الجرائم التي قد يتعرض لها المرأة الصغيرة أو في مثل هذه الأمور. الناحية الثانية المتعلقة ببعض القرارات الأخرى، القرار 1820، وأيضا هو الذي أنشأ مكتبا لممثل الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة الخاص بالعنف الجنسي في النزاعات المسلحة. ومثل هذا القرار يعمل بصورة كبيرة جدا على زيادة دعم الضحايا والناجين من العنف الجنسي، وبالتالي هو يقدم لنا مؤشر مهم للجهود الدولية، وأن المجتمع واقف ومستعد أن يقف مع ضحايا العنف الجنسي في مثل هذه النزاعات، ويقف أيضا معهم من أجل تأمين لهم أو إعادة بناء نفسيتهم التي اهتزت أو خدشت خلال هذه الجرائم. من الآليات دور المقرر الخاص للأطفال في حماية الأطفال من الانتهاكات الجنسية في النزاعات المسلحة، وهذا المقرر يلعب دور خاص مهم في مثل هذه النزاعات من خلال رصد الانتهاكات حالة العنف الجنسي، التواصل مع المنظمات الدولية لتوثيق والإبلاغ عن مثل هذه القضايا، دعوته إلى اتخاذ أو منع أي انتهاكات، تقديم أيضا الدعم لضحايا العنف الجنسي، وعمل مع المنظمات والأطراف الموجودة على الأرض المتقاتلة وحثهم بل والضغط عليهم في بعض الأحيان بشأن الجرائم التي تصل إليهم أو عبر الفرق التابعة للأمم المتحدة مثل المفوضية، مثل لجان التحقيق، إلى هؤلاء للحد منها أو الضغط عليهم لمحاسبة مرتكبيها. الآلية التي تليها التقارير التي تقدمها المنظمات المحلية إلى الأمم المتحدة كتقارير الظل، وأنا باعتقادي هذه التقارير مهمة جدا لأنها تقدم حالة كاشفة للواقع الذي يعيشه الأطفال داخل الإطار المحلي. ربما الدول والمؤسسات الحكومية غالبا لا تقدم المعلومات بصورة شفافة وواضحة، خاصة فيما يتعلق بالقصور التشريعي أو بقصور عمل آليات ومؤسسات الدولة سواء على المستوى الأمني أو على المستوى القضائي. وبالتالي أصبح مثل هذه المنظمة وهذه الآليات مهمة جدا للتعريف بواقع قضايا العنف الجنسي، لأنه إذا الأمم المتحدة أدركت في من خلال هذه التقارير يمكن أن تتخذ خطوات جادة نحو هذا المجتمع، خاصة وأن التقارير تشمل على توصيات معينة، سواء هذه التوصيات متعلقة بالقصور التشريعي أو متعلقة بإنشاء مؤسسات مستقلة للأطفال يصبح من السهولة التعامل معها، أو دفع الحكومات لزيادة الوعي بقضايا العنف الجنسي وخلق يعني تحقيقات شفافة في مثل هذه القضايا. الآلية الرابعة والخامسة ما يتعلق بمحكمة الجنايات الدولية. طبعا ندرك من الناحية السياسية أن الأمر معقد نوعا ما، لكن الذي أؤكد عليه إلى أن حالات الانتهاكات الجنسية في النزاعات المسلحة تدخل ضمن اختصاص محكمة الجنايات الدولية، ويمكن ملاحقة مرتكبي مثل هذه الجرائم إذا ارتكبت وفق شروط معينة، سواء كانت واسعة النطاق أو كانت محددة على أقلية معينة. لكن بشكل عام هذه أحد الآليات، ومن حق المدعي العام أن يفتح تحقيقا متى وصلت إليه معلومات كاملة عن انتهاكات جنسية موثقة بأدلة يرى أنه يمكن أن يفتح مثل هذه التحقيق، خاصة أن محكمة الجنايات الدولية تتعاون في الغالب مع المنظمات الدولية والمنظمات غير الحكومية بشأن حقوق الطفل ومكافحة العنف الجنسي، وبالتالي تبادل هذه المعارف والخبرات واللقاءات وإعداد التقارير الموثوقة من خبراء يمكن أيضا أن يساهم في تحريك مثل هذه القضايا. الآلية التي تليها المنظمات الدولية غير الحكومية، الذي أقصدها الصليب الأحمر، منظمة الطفولة، اليونيسيف، أيضا هذه تلعب دور كبير جدا في حماية الأطفال والنساء وغيرها مما قد يتعرض له بالعنف الجنسي، حيث أنه نحن لا يمكن أن نتجاهل دور الصليب بتقديم مساعدات إنسانية ضرورية للنساء والفتيات مثل المأوى إلى غير ذلك. وأيضا هي تعمل على بناء قدرات العاملين في الميدان، والأهم من ذلك أنها تعمل أو تمارس ضغط ما على حكومة وعلى المجتمع الدولي في أحيان إذا تفشت هذه الظاهرة لاتخاذ إجراءات فعالة لتحسين الوضع وتعزيز الإجراءات القانونية والمؤسسية المتعلقة بمكافحة العنف الجنسي وحماية النساء والأطفال والفتيات الذين تعرضوا لمثل هذا الأمر، وأيضا تقيم نوع من الشراكة مع المنظمات الدولية المنظمات المدنية العاملة في الميدان. آخر هذه الإجراءات أنا برأيي الإطار القانوني الدولي، وهذا مهم. الاتفاقيات المتعلقة بمكافحة المتعلقة بالمرأة، المتعلقة بالطفل، مكافحة الانتهاكات الجنسية، هذه الأطر مهمة جدا أن تشكل لنا مرجعية سواء للمطالبة بتغيير التشريعات الداخلية أو بزيادة الحماية والضغط على المجتمعات المحلية التي لا تلتزم بهذه الاتفاقيات، خاصة لدينا اتفاقية جنيف التي تلزم في أثناء النزاع بوجوب الحفاظ على الأطفال وحمايتهم على أكمل وجه. ولأنه نحن ندرك أن الأطفال في أي نزاع مسلح هم يعتبرون الطرف الأضعف، وربما قد يكونون هم وقود المعركة في مثل عملية التجنيد الإجباري أو التجنيد للأطفال ليكونون في داخل هذه الجبهات. إذا هذه هي مجمل ما أردت أن أختصره من تحديات، من آليات، قد تكون هناك تحديات أخرى، آليات أخرى، لكن الذي أريد أن أؤكده أننا أمام قضايا معقدة، لأنها لا تتعلق بقضية جنائية، بمعنى يمكن أن وضعها في إطار قانوني أمام محقق ما ثم الذهاب إلى القضاء. نحن أمام قضية متشابكة من الناحية القانونية، من الناحية الاجتماعية، من الناحية التعليمية، وتحتاج إلى جهود مستمرة ومتشابكة حتى يشعر المجتمع والأطفال بنوع من الأمان، ويدرك المجتمع أن هذه الجريمة أن الطفل الذي يقع في مثل هذه الجريمة هو ضحية، يجب مناصرته، يجب الوقوف خلفه وخلف أسرته. ومن المهم حتى أن تنشأ منظمات أو مؤسسات يمنية تدعم الأسر التي يتعرض أطفالها لمثل هذه الانتهاكات. شكرا لكم.
شكرا أستاذ توفيق. موجودة يا أكرم؟
ماشي.
معلش أنا أعتذر، بس في مشكلة اليوم في الشبكة في مصر، فكل شوية يقطع الاتصال. شكرا أستاذ توفيق. زي ما قال الأستاذ إنه العملية بالفعل متكاملة، هي مش دور رصد فقط أو رصد منظمات حقوقية أو رصد أو دور كمان ناشطين أو دور حقوقيين، لا، العملية هي تبدأ قانونيا وبعدين يجي دور منظمات المجتمع المدني ومنظمات الاهتمام والتوجيه الضحايا أو تبني الضحايا. بالأول والأخير الطفل أو الأسرة بحاجة إلى قاعدة أو إلى فضاء آمن بأنه يقدر يلقى له في حال إنه تعرض هذا الطفل للتحرش، سواء كان محاولة أو تحرش كامل أو تعنيف خلال التحرش أو الاعتداء الجنسي. إنه في الأول الأخير إحنا محتاجين لهذه المساحة الآمنة بطريقة أو بأخرى، إن كانت قانونية أو حقوقية أو حتى نفسية. وما ننساش كمان دور الدعم النفسي، وإنه دائما مؤسسة رصد تكرر إنه في حال لو وجد أي حالة حابب أنت كفرد في المجتمع تبلغ عنها، إنه مؤسسات كثيرة منها رصد تتبنى تقديم الدعم النفسي للأسرة وللطفل أيضا. الآن بننتقل لمحور آخر، وهو استعراض حول فرص جبر الضرر للضحايا والناجين من العنف الجنسي المرتبط بالنزاع. سيكون معنا السيدة مارتا منديز وأيضا السيدة فيونا ميكي، وهما أيضا السيدة مارتا هي استشارية مستقلة عملت كمندوبة للجنة الدولية للصليب الأحمر لمدة 7 سنوات في دول عدة من ضمنهم اليمن وسوريا، وأيضا عملت على عدد من الأبحاث حول العدالة الانتقالية في اليمن. أما السيدة فيونا فهي محامية قانونية ودولية واستشارية مستقلة متخصصة في العدالة الدولية مع تركيز خاص على التعويض وأشكال أخرى من الاستجابة لانتهاكات جسيمة لحقوق الإنسان. نبدأ الآن مع السيدة مارتا. تفضلي سيدة ماركا وبعدها السيدة فيونا.
Thank you so much, Aya, and thank you to my dear colleagues from Watch for Human Rights. In fact, Aya, if you don't mind, Fiona will start and I will follow her. Thank you so much for your understanding. Thank you, Fiona.
Thank you. Yes, we thought it made more sense because I will start by setting the scene in terms of the kind of international law framework, and then Marta will talk more specifically about the implications for reparation for sexual violence in Yemen. Well, first of all, I guess the first important point is that the right to reparation for violations of human rights and international humanitarian law is very well established. And of course, that includes sexual violence and violence against other violence, against violations against children. There are many treaties, UN resolutions that reaffirm this right. In 2005, the UN agreed a set of basic principles and guidelines that set out what the right to reparations means in the context of serious violations. And then in 2014, the UN Secretary General issued a guidance note on reparations specifically for conflict-related sexual violence. So I just refer to those in case you are interested to follow up with those documents. And a couple of important points to bear in mind from the start. One is that it has been increasingly emphasized in UN resolutions and also by civil society that any reparations process must be survivor-centered. And that means that it must be based on consultations and active participation by survivors themselves, right from the beginning, from designing any process right through to implementation, so that any reparation addresses the actual needs and wishes of survivors. And another key point is that in order to be adequate and effective, reparation must be prompt. Reparation is a right that should be exercised immediately. And of course, many survivors do have urgent needs that must be addressed. And they should not have to wait, for example, until a peace agreement or some eventual comprehensive reparations scheme. So what does reparation mean for violations? There is a common misconception that reparations really means money, means monetary compensation. But in the context of serious violations of human rights and humanitarian law, there are actually 5 forms of reparations recognized, and it will depend on each case which one will be relevant. So the first one is restitution, and that's restoring the victim to the situation before the violation occurred as far as possible. And in the context of sexual violence, this could be many things. It could mean restoration of liberty, maybe of education, many things. The second type is indeed compensation, especially compensation for types of harm that cannot be restored, including things like pain and suffering that's been suffered. The third form, or the third type of reparation that's recognized is rehabilitation. And this means both physical and psychological rehabilitation. The fourth type is generally termed satisfaction. And that means a whole range of things, including formal acknowledgement that a violation has taken place, establishing the truth, things like commemorations and memorials, and accountability for those responsible. And then the fifth form of reparation recognized for these kinds of violations is guarantees that the violations won't be repeated. So that might involve reform of the law, training of different officials, these kinds of things. And one note on Arabic translation: often the term reparation is translated incorrectly as ta'awid, ta'awidat, which literally means compensation. But actually, in order to really make it clear that reparation is not about money only, the statute of the International Criminal Court translates the term reparations as جبر الضرار المجني عليهم. So literally reparation for the harm done to the victims. I point that out because it's very common that the term reparation in Arabic is mistranslated. So who is entitled to reparation? Individuals, but also there are a lot of examples internationally of collective reparation where a group has been targeted. And it's been pointed out in the context of sexual violence that providing reparation in a more collective way can sometimes help to address problems of stigma, for example. Who should provide reparation? Well, of course, states primarily have an obligation. They have an obligation both to provide access to justice so that victims can claim reparation, and to provide reparation themselves, of course, where they are responsible. But another important point to bear in mind is that where the party responsible for serious violations are unable or unwilling to provide reparation, states are supposed to try to step in and, for example, establish programs for reparations and for assistance to victims. So, in other words, states shouldn't just step back and say, oh, well, it's nothing to do with us. They have obligations to act in the face of violations. I won't go into this in detail, but armed groups and corporations may, in some circumstances, also have obligations in terms of reparations. Now, of course, very important question, how can reparation be actually delivered in practice? What are the different kinds of mechanisms? And I'll mention 3 types of mechanisms that you see internationally. mechanisms for delivering reparations in response to serious and large-scale violations. One is international reparations schemes. You may be aware, for example, of the Claims Commission set up by the UN following the invasion for Iraq, following its invasion of Kuwait. And sometimes there are international schemes where states agree between themselves. And of course, something like this, it would be very unlikely that the United Nations would act in this way unless they were to receive a request from the relevant government, so the government of Yemen. The second mechanism, if you like, is national administrative reparations programs. And there are many examples where an individual state has set up some kind of reparations program, often following some kind of truth commission or investigative process. And as many of you will be aware, and civil society has pointed out, the processes that have been initiated so far, both by the Yemeni government and members of the international coalition, to provide any kind of reparation, have either actually not been reparation at all, or they have proved to be ineffective. They don't involve any acknowledgement of responsibility, and they've been very non-transparent. So here again, the Yemeni government could initiate steps towards establishing a proper national reparations program. Now, the third way that reparations can typically be provided is through orders of courts. And we just heard, for example, different options, although they seem extremely unlikely in the Yemen context, such as the International Criminal Court. There have been examples of some individual cases being brought in Europe and elsewhere, where an individual is found, a perpetrator is found in those countries. But the thing about court-ordered reparations is that they tend to be quite limited in scope, whereas a comprehensive program, an administrative program, can cover more survivors, be more accessible, and more standardized in terms of evidence requirements, for example. But again, coming back to the point that whatever mechanism is adopted, it's crucial to ensure that victims and survivors are consulted and are able to participate actively. And also bear in mind that victims may actually prioritize things like psychological support or protection, medical support, over things like criminal prosecution. And also worth bearing in mind that in a political context, such as peace process, negotiations for a peace process, reparations can actually be easier to raise and to get support for than, for example, criminal accountability. And just to say that, you know, in the context of what I already mentioned, and the fact that survivors should not have to wait for some eventual process to get any reparation, the UN guidance note that I mentioned on reparation for conflict-related sexual violence stresses that urgent interim reparations and assistance should be available. And this in particular often might need to include psychological support and economic empowerment, which are often big, urgent priorities. So what's the way forward? Well, it follows from what I've said that there are steps that would need to be taken by the Yemeni government, but also an important role for civil society and for the international community to move ahead to really make meaningful progress on reparation. And of course, there are many risks, raising expectations. There are the risks that we've already seen, that payments to victims might be presented as reparations when they're not really. But there are many things that can be done, even while the conflict is still ongoing, or at least while a peace process has not been concluded. Many things that can be done to establish what the needs are, to start consulting victims, to consider what is the most appropriate mechanism for dealing with reparations for sexual violence and for violence against children in Yemen. So I will stop there and hand over to Marta.
Thank you very much, Fiona, for the great presentation, as always. I'll focus more on the practical side, going back to one of the points that Fiona made with regards ensuring the participation of victims and survivors in the design of these reparation measures. And what I'm going to be sharing with you is based on some research that Fiona, myself, and 2 other colleagues have been conducting about conflict-related sexual violence in Yemen. So these points are based specifically on, we initiated this research last year in the first quarter of 2023 with a mapping study that we were conducting for an organization called the Global Survivors Fund. And I would like just to take a few minutes here to talk a little bit about this organization, because it's important to understand also what this research is about and why it focuses solely on survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. So the Global Survivors Fund, also known as GSF, is an international organization that was created in 2019 by 2 Nobel Peace Prize laureates to promote access to reparations for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And one of the basic premises guiding the Global Survivors Fund action is that people affected by conflict-related sexual violence around the globe have a right to reparation. However, in reality, reparations, but also other forms of redress for these kind of survivors have often not been prioritized on policy agendas, not only at the local or national level, but also at the regional and international levels. This means that only a very small number of conflict-related sexual violence survivors, including children, they constitute a big part of the survivors, are able to obtain redress and other forms of reparation for the harms that they suffered. It is also very important to note here that of those programs that exist today, very few are based on the participation of survivors. Maybe survivors have been included more recently, but this was not so much the case a few years ago. It's definitely a tendency, and it's definitely something that we are all promoting, not only for reparations, but as you know, for wider work on transitional justice. But in general, a lot of the work and a lot of the things that we continue seeing in the realm of transitional justice and in the area of reparation continues to lack this very important component, which is the participation and of victims and survivors. So now specifically speaking about the research that Fiona, myself, and 2 colleagues from Yemen conducted about conflict-related sexual violence in Yemen, I think it's important to note here that it's really difficult to start something just like that in Yemen. You know, there's many steps that need to be followed and many conditions that need to be in place even before we consider consulting survivors, sitting down with them, especially to talk about a topic like sexual violence, and especially to talk about sexual violence which has been committed by parties to the conflict. So the way that, in terms of methodology, that we organized our approach was, we started with a mapping, and that took us almost all of 2023. And then we initiated a preliminary study towards the end of 2023. In December, we also went to Aden to conduct a field trip. And the purpose of the preliminary study and also of the mapping study was really to assess whether, not only whether we had a minimum threshold with regards to the existence of sexual violence in Yemen in relation to the conflict, but also to understand, what were the risks and what are the risks for survivors to conduct larger numbers, or to conduct consultations with survivors and other victims. It's very important because, as you know, one of the most important principles to bear in mind is that of do no harm. So we went to Yemen to meet with very different interlocutors, not only from the internationally recognized government, but also we met with many civil society organizations and other types of organizations to really understand how could a country study looking specifically at reparations and based essentially on consultations with survivors from Yemen could take place, bearing in mind the current circumstances, namely the fact that the conflict is ongoing in large parts of the country, in most of it actually, and that, as Dan said, it's a very this topic creates a lot of stigma for the survivors and victims coming forward and for their families too. And this is what we would like to share with you, based on the mapping study and based on the preliminary study, especially our trip to Aden and the meetings we had, what was shared that can help us more and less understand how these consultations with survivors can take place in the future. And when I say consultations with survivors, it's consultations for the design of future reparations also for survivors of conflict-related sexual violence. And I'll share a few because I know time is short and I think we are all very eager to listen to Zoe, but I'll share with you some of these inputs that were shared with us from colleagues, including also from survivors themselves. I think one of the most raised challenges by our colleagues in Yemen is the fact that it's very important to conduct consultations with survivors, but we know that this will take time to materialize. And until that takes place, it's also important to ensure that these survivors today and these victims can already have access not only to justice, as you Dan said and Fiona, but also to some sort of interim assistance or relief programs, specifically bearing in mind the types of harms that we are suffering here. So that was one point shared. Another point shared, which I also find very important, and I think you all agree here, is that consultations with survivors need to be carried out in tandem or in close partnership with Yemeni colleagues. That's essential for many, many reasons, because organizations know truly best how the local dynamics, who are the survivors, what are the risks that survivors face if they decide to come forward, not only to report on the crime, but also to have a mere conversation on this topic, which can be already in itself something extremely risky, especially, if internationals are involved. So I think it's very, very important to understand that there's no way to carry out this type of work without a high degree of involvement by Yemeni organizations. And the colleagues from Yemen meant, by Yemeni organizations, they meant not only civil society organizations, but to some extent also members from the ministries, from the internationally recognized government that work on these issues. It's very important to create those bridges because, as Fiona was saying, ultimately the obligation to provide reparations is upon the government. So it's important also to the extent possible, and whilst preserving anonymity and also the dignity of the survivors, to involve the relevant government counterparts. I'll give you two more examples and then I finalize. I think another very interesting point mentioned by most of our colleagues was that whilst carrying out these consultations with survivors, it's important to involve the community. As Dan was saying in his presentation, there's a lot of stigma. There's a lack of knowledge about these topics. Victims are seen somehow and in many situations almost as the perpetrators. So it's important to conduct awareness raising for the community and for many situations for the relatives, because Fiona and I also understand from our research that in many situations, the crime or the violation can be also perpetrated by family members. So it's important to keep an open mind when it comes to awareness raising and have different groups that are to be targeted. And finally, I would say that one important thing, and that really resonated with us when we were in Aden, it's all lovely to talk about reparations and to talk about transitional justice work, but what we start, we need to finish. Many organizations, many survivors were very frustrated by programs that are initiated, but that afterwards have no continuity, either because there's no donor, no donor support, or there's no financial support, because ultimately this is ultimately very bad for the victims, because when we are speaking to them, either we want it or not, we are raising their expectations, and not to continue what we start. It's a I don't know, it's a lack of trust to them. It's feels almost like a betrayal. So I think it's important, to the extent possible, once we start on consultations and assessments and other types of processes, like Fiona was mentioning some, it's important that we have at least some guarantees that we can carry the work forward, especially since it involves to a large extent a lot of consultations with survivors. So here are some points. Fiona and I and our two colleagues are expecting to finalize a report, and we expect it very much also to be published. And I think it would be a great complement to the great work that Watch for Human Rights and others are already carrying out in this area. And thank you for your time, and I give you the floor, Aya. Thank you.
معلش
شكرا.
يا آية بس أنا حابب أشكر الزميلتين فيونا ومارتا على التقديم الرائع. وحقيقة أنا سعيد جدا أن أنا سمعت من مارتا أن هناك عمل فعليا على هذا الملف الحساس جدا، لأننا فعليا كنا فاقدين الأمل أن هنالك أي جهات مهتمة بهذا النمط من الانتهاكات الذي يتوسع وينتشر ويستفعل في اليمن في ظل الصمت وتجاهل مريب. يعني سنكون سعداء أيضا بالحصول على هذه النسخة من الدراسة، والتي قد تفيدنا أيضا في العمل المستقبلي من أجل مواجهة هذا النمط من أنماط الانتهاكات. زميلتي آية، ممكن نكمل؟
أوكي تمام، شكرا أكرم، وشكرا لسيدتان فيونا ومارتا أيضا. نحب التنويه كمان للمشاركين معنا في هذه الندوة بأنه في نهاية الجلسة سيتم تخصيص 10 دقائق للرد على الأسئلة، فأي استفسار ممكن نحطها على خانة الأسئلة. الآن لدينا المتحدث الأخير والمحور الأخير، المتحدثة بالأصح السيدة زودوغيل، وهي مستشارة دولية، ستقدم استعراض حول العنف الجنسي في سياق العدالة الانتقالية في حالات النزاع وما بعد انتهاء النزاع، وهي عاملة في مجال نزع السلاح المجتمعي لبرنامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائي، وعملت أيضا كمديرة لمشروع حفظ السلام، وأيضا تقلدت عدد من المناصب فيما يخص السلام والأمن، أبرزهم أنها قادت مشروع لبناء القدرات الخاصة بالشرطة الوطنية الأفغانية في مجال حقوق الطفل للمكتب الدولي لحقوق الطفل بالتعاون مع يونيسيف في الفترة من 2015 إلى 2016. سيدة زو، المايك معك، تفضلي.
Thank you so much, Aya and colleagues. So I am the last presenter, but I think what I want to talk about is very much in line, let's say, following what my colleagues have already presented. I want to talk a little bit about transitional justice mechanisms. So I think that we have already touched on international prosecutions, reparations, and we have discussed through the very excellent documentary and the report presented by Dan about national prosecutions and what are the obstacles that you are facing in Yemen at the moment. I just want to say a word on this. I think these are not, don't feel that these problems are only in Yemen. We see these problems everywhere, especially regarding sexual violence prosecution. Even in my country of Canada, there's been some recent cases of judges, for example, asking victims what they were wearing the night that they were raped. So I think that one of my colleagues has mentioned this. I just want to share this because I think this is very much a challenge everywhere. What I want to talk about today is present to you a mechanism that is called Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, or Truth Commissions. And I'm going to say a word on vetting processes as well. I would like to focus specifically, I have a presentation, but it's in English, so I'm not sure it's very useful, so I may just talk if that's okay. So this is in the context of mostly post-conflict settings, but it doesn't mean that you're not able to start when the conflict is ongoing. And I think this actually really important to start while the conflict is ongoing. So I'm really interested to hear all of your examples of really great work that you've been doing on this topic. Truth commissions are created by national processes, mostly in many cases with the help of the international community. What does that mean? It can mean some expertise sharing, experience sharing between countries that have had truth commissions, and funding is a very important aspect. So I think sometimes we don't talk enough about funding because without funding, it's very difficult to do these kinds of processes and to do them effectively. Many of my colleagues have mentioned challenges in dealing with sexual violence against children, against women, and against men. If you want to do this properly, you do need to have protection mechanisms in place for the children that are participating in your process. You do have to have social workers and psychologists that are on call to assist the children that are talking to you. And this is very difficult in many, many contexts, especially in conflict and post-conflict settings where many people have left the country due to the various violence committed, and especially when the conflict is ongoing for many years, as in the case of Yemen. So a lot of professionals have left the country. You are left with very few, let's say, professionals in the field of working with children that are traumatized by various violations. So I started my career in Sierra Leone in the early 2000s, where there was a truth commission after a very long and horrific conflict that had a lot of sexual violence. I worked for the truth commission that was established there. And it was a conflict that, let's say, targeted very much children as children, because there was a lot of recruitment of children for armed forces and rebel groups. And so I think that this is also what you have been describing in Yemen. So what does that mean for children? It means that they are victims and survivors, but most of the time, a lot of them are also perpetrators. And so how did we address this? We addressed this by creating mechanisms within the Truth Commission that were, let's say, trying to involve children as they were. So we invited them to come and testify, and this is done in many contexts of Truth Commissions, especially in wars that involve child soldiers. So without categorizing what they were or how we perceive them, we invited, Truth Commission can invite children to come and give statements to qualified statement takers. And in this, you want to make sure that the child is not judged. So a lot of you have been conducting these interviews. They are very difficult, but also can be very rewarding. Children are very resilient. Sometimes they will surprise us. So I just want to talk about a little bit what kind of mechanisms can be created. So I was talking about truth commissions. So truth commissions are normally a little bit of a formal process. They are not necessarily judicial. In fact, most of the time they are not. So in the case of how they can be created, normally they need to have a formal mandate, and this comes often by acts of parliament. So this is, let's say, if you're having a transition during a conflict or at the end of a conflict, they can be negotiated to be included in peace agreements. So many conflicts have finished with a peace agreement, and you can, as civil society and as Yemenis, you can ask to have these kinds of formal mechanisms. What you do with the Truth Commission is very much has to be locally owned. So it's very dependent on local context, what the war or the conflict has been bringing to the country, the local culture and the local norms. So they can be adapted to a range of different contexts. And so it's really important that the type of mechanisms that is established is really reflective of what the local context needs. Okay, so if established from outside by the international community with a mandate that doesn't reflect what is needed, then it will have very little impact. And we've seen this in a number of countries where the mandate of, let's say, the transitional justice mechanism was not adapted to the context. So this is where actually when the mechanism is being discussed, whether it's through a formal peace agreement or whether it's through any other kind of national dialogue, it's very important that the input from civil society, from government institutions, is already been being taken into account. What is needed? How long is the let's say the mandate of the Truth Commission? Like, meaning what are they looking at in times of term period? In the context of sexual violence, very important that there is a clear mention in the mandate of the Truth Commission that they have to look at sexual violence and violations of human rights around sexual offenses, that they have to pay specific attention to children. So those can be inserted in the Act of Parliament or any official document or law that is created the Commission. Why is this important? Because if you don't mention it there, as my colleagues have mentioned, it can fall by the side because it's a difficult topic, it's creating stigma, and it's not easy to involve children and other adults, victims of sexual violence in these processes. So it has to be mentioned in the mandate, otherwise all the barriers that you've been describing will be very much still in place once you start the work. Then Truth Commissions should have specific procedures determined to work with children. So this is whether children are victims of sexual violence or any other violations. So very important, as I said, not to pre-categorize children, not to prejudge them. A lot of children will not necessarily come forward and tell you, I want to discuss that I was sexually abused or raped. They will want to discuss their experience during the conflict. So this is a very good way that has been used with several transitional justice mechanisms, that to invite children to come and talk about their experience. Within that discussion, they may mention rape or sexual violence, okay? So this is, the people discussing with the children have to be prepared for this. So children will not categorize violations of human rights. They cannot do that. They will tell you what has happened to them. They will tell you about the stigma that they are facing, the hardship that they are facing. And I think just following on what Marta was saying, it's really important not to overpromise. These mechanisms are meant to listen to victims and survivors. They are not meant to promise things that may not be followed through with. So this can go through the Truth Commissions normally have several processes. Statement taking is what I'm describing. Let's say you would sit with children. This comes after outreach. Most Truth Commissions will very much look, before they start their work, at other work that has been done, such as the work for Watch for Human Rights, just described now in this webinar, and the work that Marta and Fiona were doing, and other civil society mapping reports, analysis on violations, sexual violations during the conflict. So the Truth Commission can gather these, and this is where civil society should be very much involved in discussing what they see as appropriate in terms of the context of the violations and what the Truth Commission can do. Then, of course, normally they have investigation powers. They can do public hearings. A lot of things that have been done with children in the past by Truth Commissions is in-camera hearings. So that means only the child with officials of the Commission in a setting that is a child-friendly space as much as possible, where they can be free to explain their experience, the violations committed against them in a context where their identity is completely protected. Truth Commissions can recommend prosecutions with all of the issues that have been discussed already, so I'm not going to go through them. So prosecutions, especially at the international level, but also at the national level, are often very limited. There's not a lot of them. They may not have the conclusion that the survivor wants. And so it can be very frustrating and re-traumatizing, especially for children, to go through a legal process. So Truth Commissions are an alternative to this in a way that children are able to come and discuss their experiences without having to go through questioning and all the forms of further violations that have been described by my colleagues and in your investigation so far. Truth commissions can also recommend reparations program, as Fiona was just discussing. So this is also one of the processes where a civil society can be involved in what is appropriate with all the different 5 types that Fiona has mentioned. One of them can be prosecution of individual perpetrators. So this is possible when feasible. Again, not necessarily always useful if the outcome is not possible to be very satisfactory. Confidentiality is the main important thing when you're talking to children in truth commission settings because of stigma, but also because of actual threats, physical threats, and imprisonment, as you were describing. So those are all possible consequences of a child discussing their experiences and their violations with truth commission or any other investigation mechanism. So this is the most important thing, confidentiality and protection. I think my colleagues have gone through this, so I'm not going to go through it too much, but I just want to say also that it's not just during the process, it's also how do you keep the information stored, including archiving, so where you don't want to identify the child at any step of your process, so that it cannot be something cannot come back to them, let's say, after the process is finalized in terms of threats, prosecution for having been a victim of sexual violence, and so on. It's important to have a gendered approach. So I was really interested to see that sexual violence against boys has been documented by yourselves. So this is really important not to assume, let's say, that only girls get raped and so on. But how is the impact, let's say, specifically on girls and on boys, because those impacts may differ. They will affect the rest of their lives in different ways. And so basically the main issue here is to involve children, boys and girls, in these processes, but with let's say their well-being in mind at the forefront. So not to question them, let them feel free to discuss and protect their identity. There's a few examples of truth commissions that have involved children in their processes. So, for example, I think one of you was talking about participation as a very important right of children in any context. And so a lot of mechanisms of transitional justice have taught that it's really important to involve children. It's their right, although it can be dangerous, re-traumatizing, and so on. It still needs to be attempted, of course, with the well-being of the child in mind at every step. It can be empowering for children to be able to tell their stories if it's done in a safe space where they're not being put at risk of further victimization. And also it's important to record their experiences because they are, let's say, the next generation that will take over the country after there's a peace agreement, after there's a transition. So what is their experience? How can they be reintegrated into society based on the violations that they've suffered? And what is their hope for the future? So this is really important. A number of truth commissions have used processes that are not just the testimony or the hearing, but also involving children through the production of art forms where they would express their trauma from the conflict, but also what they see the future of the country to be. We did this in Sierra Leone. We collected a lot of art forms from children, and this was made into an exhibit that was toured in schools. Other truth commissions will also, when they issue their final report, which is normally like a very big document with a lot of recommendations, maybe a reparations program, as Marta and Fiona were discussing, they would also probably, in a lot of cases, point the finger for specific types of violations to either individual perpetrators or institutional ones. In the case of many conflicts, what has been done is to say, for example, in the case of sexual violence, it's been committed, let's say, by all the factions. I was seeing this in the report that was presented earlier with the 18 cases. So let's say you had hundreds of cases documented or thousands. Then it becomes very powerful to say this faction committed 20% of the cases and so on. And this is published, let's say, as a final report that is public. And then can bring reparations demands from various armed groups, the national army, the government, and other types of maybe reparations that are more like around commemoration, could be public apologies to take the blame for what has happened as an institution. This can be also security forces. It doesn't have to be the army. It can be the police, for example, or even government institutions that have failed to protect children against these types of violations or failed to prosecute, as was described extensively during this webinar. What do you do to reach out back to children once they've participated, and children in general in the country? Well, you can also make a child-friendly version of this final report. So a lot of commissions was involved in Sierra Leone and Kenya have produced versions of the final report that are meant for different age groups. So children, teenagers, or older children, and this can be used in schools. So this is when you're a little bit at the end of the process. It can be one of the recommendations that these reports are used in schools and school curriculum over the country so that children can get educated on what has happened to children during the conflict. We can also do video reports versions, like the documentary you prepared. So something like that to talk about various topics of sexual violations during the conflict, and also how this is affecting children during the conflict, but also after in their future. I'm conscious of time, so I just wanted to say one final point. When prosecutions, especially for sexual violence, are not possible, or that they are unsatisfactory or at the risk of re-traumatizing children, truth commissions can serve as an alternate mechanism, let's say, to allow children to express themselves. The information can be used later in prosecution, whether international or national, because it creates a context for the violations. It can be attached to specific perpetrators or institutions, as I described. They can be used in vetting processes for security forces. So in the context of Yemen, I cannot presume to see what will happen when the conflict comes to a resolution, but in a lot of countries, there is sometimes an integration of various militias and armed groups in the national army as a form of moving forward and reconciliation. So how do you deal with the perpetrators, especially of sexual violence, that are integrated in these new security forces and national armed forces? So this can be the information that is collected by truth commissions can be used, let's say, to go through a vetting process of actual individuals within these forces and commanders and so on. And then finally, my colleague Tafik was talking about how do you change, let's say, the stigma around sexual violence in the culture. So this can also, Truth Commission can help in starting that dialogue in the sense of describing the violations that were committed, and to make sure that there is no, there's a demonstration that children were victimized through this process and were not acting on their own volition. And so in that context, this is not going to change any culture, but it can start, let's say, a dialogue on the topic. Yes. So thank you so much for listening to me, and I would be happy to take any questions.
شكرا عزيزتي زو. طبعا هناك الكثير من التساؤلات في صندوق الأسئلة. معظم هذه التساؤلات تم الرد عليها من قبل المتحدثين مشكورين، ونظرا لضيق الوقت فقد انتهى الوقت، وأعتقد أن هناك ارتباطات أخرى للمتحدثين، فاحنا اخذنا مجموعة الاسئلة التي موجودة، وممكن حطيت برضو الايميل. انتم ممكن تحطوا او اي ارسال اي تساؤلات او تعليقات على قد تخص التقرير او الفيلم او محور اللقاء بشكل عام، وسيتم الرد عليكم جميعا فيها. وختاما طبعا أؤكد على أهمية تضافر الجهود والعمل معا كناشطين ومنظمات وأفراد ومجتمع محلي، وكذلك فاعلين دوليين، من أجل الحد من هذا الانتهاك وإعطائه حقه ليكون ضمن أولويات عملية السلام والعدالة في اليمن. ويجب أن نكون سندا وعونا لهؤلاء الضحايا وذويهم الذين لا حول لهم ولا قوة، يصارعون وحدهم في ظل تعامي السلطات وغياب منظومة العدالة المحلية، أو آه، خضوع سيطرة أطراف النزاع والنافذين أيضا لتعطيل عمل هذه القوانين ومنظومة العدالة بشكل عام. ختاما أشكركم جميعا. أشكر المتحدثين كلهم باسمه، أشكر المترجمة ريم على جهدها، وكذلك الميسرة الأستاذة آية رغم المعوقات التي حصلت معها. كذلك جزيل الشكر لفريق مؤسسة راست باحثين، وكذلك من ساهموا بفاعلية في إنتاج هذا التقرير وبروزه إلى النور وخروج هذا الفيلم، والذي يعتبر بادرة أولى يعني في ظل غياب شبه كلي لمناقشة هذا المحور على المستوى المحلي. أكرر شكري لكم وامتناني الكثير لمشاركة الجميع، وتحياتي لكم جميعا، ولنا لقاء.